Ruth chapter 1, be reading the entire chapter. Hear the word of the Lord. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she rose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. But Ruth clung to her, and she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stunned because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, one of the secrets of effective communication is to be as picturesque, as concrete as possible. Tell a story that people can see in their minds. Don't just use abstractions, speak in generalities. For example, let me tell you a story. In 2011, during an unusual warm spell in February, I was at the footbridge across the Dan River, about to start a run on the Riverwalk, when a lady reporter from the local TV station with a cameraman approached me and asked what I thought about the warm weather. Now, I wanted to say something that people could envision instead of just kind of, something general comment. Yeah, I like it when it's warmer. So I said, it's good to be able to go jogging without sweatpants and a toboggan and gloves on. I could just go out in shorts and a t-shirt. Unfortunately, the reporter didn't quite get my point and summed me up for the TV audience as saying that I like the warm weather because I could go out with fewer clothes on, which could lead people to wonder how I'd go jogging in July. People want to see things, not just hear abstract lectures about ideas. As they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's why people learn by example or by actually doing things, not just hearing about it, particularly not just hearing about ideas. In our culture, in Western culture, the culture, the academic people often think the way to be sophisticated is to talk in abstractions, principles, and philosophies. If you don't believe me, well, let me tell you a story. I saw a panel discussion of a group of scholars and experts about ethics. They were discussing ethics. Along with a man on the panel was a man who had been a lieutenant in the Vietnam War. He had a hook for one hand, I assume from a combat injury. They brought up the case of what would you do if you were in charge of a platoon on an important mission in battle and one of your soldiers just froze in fear and wouldn't move on. The scholars kind of gave their abstract blather, ambiguous talk about principles, nothing practical. Then the lieutenant spoke up and said, point blank, you shoot him. You just can't let one man destroy the mission. Now, I'm not sure whether he's right, and I'm not necessarily endorsing that, but I was just glad to hear an answer that I could see that could be put into practice. That wasn't just empty words. A picture is worth 1,000 words. That's why, unlike in modern Western philosophy with this love of thousands and thousands of abstract words, most people love things that they can see, at least see in their minds, in their imaginations. One of the most popular books in the Bible is the book of Proverbs because it contains all these little picturesque stories, Proverbs, which you can see in your mind. Now, Proverbs doesn't just say, be loyal, but in Proverbs 3 it says to bind steadfast love around your neck like a necklace. Like some people wear something valuable, like their ID or keys around their neck. So they don't lose them. So they have them easily available at all times. Proverbs says, do that with steadfast love. You can see that, can't you? Well, that's what Ruth is like. It's like a child asking, what is love? Or God's sovereignty? Or losing faith? Or providence? What does it look like? The Western theologian wants to write a heavy book full of philosophy. The Bible answers with this. Ruth, a story, a few word pictures that are worth 1,000,000 theology books. What does love look like? Well, let me tell you a story. In the time of the judges, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, when there was no king to make people do what is right, when lawlessness makes love grow cold, there was a man from Bethlehem who went to Moab because of a famine. Moab is directly across the Red Sea from Judah. If your Bible has maps in the back, so you can see, you'll find Moab on the eastern, that is the right side of the Dead Sea across from Judah. You can just see it there. The man's name was Elimelech, which means my God is king. His wife's name was Naomi, which means pleasant. And they're from Bethlehem, which means house of bread. They had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, I don't know how you pronounce it. When hard times came, they did what millions of people have done throughout history. They moved to greener pastures. They probably didn't intend to stay for very long in Moab, but they were probably like a lot of immigrants to the USA, thinking they'll make some money, or maybe in this case, a few seasons of crops, and then they plan on returning home. But their kids grew up there. The kids feel at home there. They marry local girls, and they find themselves merging into that country. Assimilation. That's what Elimelech and Naomi were going through. They settled down in Moab, and their two sons even get married to two local girls, Orpah and Ruth. And so they're a bigger family. They're looking forward to new generations, looking forward to assimilating into Moab. But two things happen to stop their assimilation. First, Naomi's faith stops her from assimilating. When in Moab, do as the Moabites do, right? Well, they worshipped what's called the vile god Chemosh. Jeremiah the prophet calls the Moabites the people of Chemosh. Well, many people in that time believed that a god had power only in the nation that worshiped that god. In other words, there were different gods for different nations. And so, if you're in Moab, you worship Chemosh, right? Just go along with everyone else there. Here, though, Naomi still believes, even though she's living in Moab, she still believes in the God of Israel, in the Lord, all capital letters, and Yahweh. She blesses her daughters-in-law in verse 8 with, may the Lord deal kindly, lovingly, covenantally, one of the most important words in the Bible right there, with you, even in Moab. She doesn't just believe while in Israel and then goes along with whatever other religion there is when she's in other countries. She's a real believer in the Lord, even when she's in Moab. The second thing that stopped their assimilation was death. First in verse 3, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow. And then about 10 years later in Moab, both of Naomi's sons died, leaving her now bereft. Now in that time, there's no police forces, there's no personal firearms, or firearms of any kind. There's little protection, there's no social security, hardly any opportunities to make a living for a woman outside the house. So a woman or women living by themselves with no men were very vulnerable, easy pickings for any criminal that wanted to take advantage of them, take everything, abuse them, drive them out of their own homes. And even if that didn't happen, how were they going to live? Where were they going to get food? They couldn't do the backbreaking work of farming by themselves. So now Naomi and her two daughters-in-law are desperate. Naomi's only hope, she thinks, is to return to Judah and hope her distant relatives there will help take care of her somehow. And so the daughters-in-law, loyal to her, start out with her returning to Judah. Naomi's returning to Judah for Orpah and Ruth. This is their first time going there. But they hadn't gotten very far when Naomi realizes that her Moabite daughters-in-law would be better off staying in their home country. You want to know what love looks like? It looks like someone who thinks what is best for the other person, even at one's own expense. Now here, Naomi, she's desperate. She's bereft. Probably all her possessions are slung in a bag on her back. She's sad. She's needy. And yet she doesn't manipulate her daughters-in-law to stay with her, even against their own interests. You just say something like, now how can you leave your poor old mother-in-law to fend for herself? Kind of manipulating them with guilt to make them stay with her. But instead, she does the very opposite of that. She decides to put what's best, as far as she can tell, for them ahead of her own interest. That's what love looks like. You want to know what love looks like? It looks like the loyalty Orpah and Ruth are showing to Naomi. Naomi blesses them and sends them away with, may the Lord deal kindly. The word there is, in Hebrew, is chesed. I don't do a lot of word studies in my preaching, saying the original Hebrew says this and thus and so. Often I think that's exaggerated, but it's different with this one word, chesed. Here in verse 8, it's translated kindly. It's usually translated steadfast love. It's a loyal covenant love. It's hard to define what it means with just one English word. I wonder if one reason Ruth was originally written was that someone asked, maybe some kid asked, what is chesed? And so some wise man answered, let me tell you a story of Naomi, of Ruth, of the Lord, of steadfast love. The book of Ruth is the definition of steadfast love. Now Naomi is saying in verse 8, may the Lord deal in covenant love with you just as you have with me. Their loyalty to Naomi, who has nothing to offer. There's nothing, as far as they know, that Naomi has in Judah for them to go with her there for. It's not as though she has a mansion there that she's returning to. She has nothing there. Their love for her made them willing to abandon their families, their friends, their homeland, the religion they were raised in. That loyal love that you can see here in them is what's driving them. And she wishes that the Lord would be just as loyally loving to them as they are to her. What would that look like? Well, in verse 9, that they would have the security. Notice that it translates there as security, the peace, or the rest. It's translated as rest here. But you can't have rest without security. That they would have the rest of their own house and husband. And may the Lord provide them with a new family to provide for them. Even if that means, from Naomi's point of view, if that means leaving Naomi with less. Otherwise, let me go by myself. Even if it's not to my interest, I'm really bad off. But Naomi puts them first. What loyal love looks like is both Orpah and Ruth saying in verse 10, no, we will return with you to your people. Now here they're arguing with each other. They're trying to get the other to do what is best for them at their own expense, not for themselves. Orpah and Ruth want to do what is best for Naomi, even at great sacrifice to themselves, willing to give up, as far as they can tell, their whole futures. Naomi loves and wants her daughters-in-law to do what is best for them. Go back home. At least you can go back into your society there. You have contacts there. You have people there. And so she tries to reason with them in verse 11. Turn back. Return, my daughters. She's tenderly pleading with them. Why will you go back to Judah with me? For you, it's not even going back. This is going to some whole new foreign place. Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? In their culture, if a man died, his brother was supposed to marry the widow to take care of her and carry on the name of the brother and also, just provide for the widow. But Naomi says she's not going to be producing any more sons. I'm too old. And even if she does in verses 12 and 13, have a husband immediately and bear sons, you're not going to wait that long until they grow up to marry them. No, she says in the middle of verse 13, you have no future with me. That's what Naomi thinks. That's what she's trying to convince them of. She's sure of that. So in verse 14, they cried aloud, and Orpah, as loyal as she was, finally saw that Naomi was right. So Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and went back home. If you want to see what natural, human, loyal love at its best looks like, look at Orpah. If you want to see what supernatural, steadfast love looks like, look at Ruth. Naomi looks at Ruth. Now see this picture in your mind. They're standing beside we call it a road, but it's probably not much more than a hiking trail. There's these three desperately poor women, one older, looking like she's had a hard life, bitten by grief. They're talking to each other, they're pleading, they're crying. Passers-by don't even think they're worth paying any attention to. They're three of the most unimportant people in the world. Then one turns back to Moab, and now there are only two of the most unimportant people in the world. And Naomi says in verse 15, see? Look at Orpah. Look at that. Here's something you can see. Your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, to her friends, her relatives, her connections that can give her a future, and to her gods. That vile god of Chemosh, the same god you were raised with, Ruth. Return after your sister-in-law. Go with her. Follow her example. Naomi's pleading with Ruth. But see Ruth, this young widow, standing beside some dirt path, leaving everything she's seen for nothing that she can see, but her loyalty to her dead husband's mother. What a completely pathetic figure she is. And Ruth says, her first words of this book in verse 16, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord, all capitals, the God of Israel, may the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. You want to know what love looks like? There it is. Now, these words are often used now in weddings to describe the commitment two people are making to one another in marriage. I'm sometimes tempted to be a little smart alecky and say that at a wedding you should say this pledge to your mother-in-law, because that's what Ruth is doing here. But I think it's fair that this is the kind of love marriage is supposed to be, till death do us part. But here Naomi is not returning the commitment to Ruth. This is not like a mutual. It's not going both ways. She's not going to follow Ruth. She's not going to have the vile god Chemosh be her god. This is Ruth not only committing but converting. Ruth has here become a believer in the Lord. She's not just going to help Naomi relocate back in Israel, maybe kind of inadvertently over time, gradually assimilating into Israel like so many immigrants do over history. Here, Ruth clings, she commits, and she converts. She will be with Naomi. She will be a believer in the Lord because of her love. What is the sovereignty of God? That's an abstract, kind of clumsy term. What does it mean? What's it look like? Well, let me tell you a story of Elimelech. Remember, his name means, my God is king. Kings have sovereignty. That's what they are. That's what they do. Their will is done. So, my God is king with his wife Naomi went to Moab with their 2 sons because of a famine. Their 2 sons married 2 local girls and they looked like they were going to assimilate into Moab. But Elimelech and then later the 2 sons died, leaving Naomi alone with her 2 daughters-in-law. They were loyal and wanted to return with her to Israel, but when they heard in verse 6 that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. Notice the Lord does it. He's sovereign over the end of the famine. The famine that originally drove Elimelech and Naomi and their sons to Moab was over. It's not just over because the El Nino weather patterns started the chain of events that sent rain their way. Maybe that was the natural explanation. I don't know. No one knows. But whatever, it was the Lord who was behind it. The Lord visited his people. The Lord was sovereign over the famine. He could end it because he was in charge of it in the first place. Because my God is king. What's the sovereignty of God look like? Well, it looks like God ruling calamity, not just alleviating it. If you don't have a God who rules over calamity, if you only have a God who alleviates calamity, you don't have the true God. The prophet Amos asked in Amos chapter 3 verse 6, does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it? This isn't just a kind of an abstract doctrine. Try reading that verse to a class of students on September 13, 2001, like I did. It's something you can see. You were constantly seeing it at that time. Calamity had come to a city on TV at that time. There was. There's disaster. There's calamity. And we say, not that the Lord is detached from it, that he was absent from it, that he didn't know it was going to happen, that he was unable to stop it. It's all because he's just respecting our free will, so his hands are tied by our free will, so he can't do anything. No. He was king of it. Now, if you believe that Satan does the disasters, and the Lord comes later to pick up the pieces, maybe help us pick up the pieces, or maybe just to help us feel better. Satan brings the hurricane, but only God can bring the warm emotional blanket after. If you believe that, you're a dualist. You believe that there are 2 gods, there's dual deities, and they're fighting each other. They're dueling. One is bad, he's bringing the calamities, he's bringing the diseases, the stormy times, the famines, the early deaths of men like Elimelech and his 2 sons. And the other is trying to help as best he can. He's carrying us through the hard times. Dual gods are battling it out. One trying to help us, the other trying to hurt us. This is the fantasy world some professed Christians try to bury their heads into so they won't have to deal with why, if God is almighty, that they have bad things happening in their life. Well, just Satan did it. Our free will has to allow it. One of these excuses people come up with. But in the Bible, Satan is God's Satan. In Job, Satan can only do what the Almighty God allows him to do. Now, if you believe, like Naomi, and like all the Bible, that God is almighty, that nothing happens outside his control, then you see there is one almighty God who accomplishes his will through however he chooses to do it. Then everything else you see looks different. What does the sovereignty of God look like? It looks like decreeing famine and alleviating famine. It looks like Naomi coming back home to Bethlehem. The whole town is humming. It's a buzz about her. It's been 10 years since she's been away. And she's hard bitten by tragedy. They could hardly recognize her. Is this Naomi? Pleasant? She says, don't call me pleasant. She says in verse 20, call me Mara, bitter. For the Almighty, notice that's what she calls God here. The Almighty. In Hebrew, the Shaddai. Like El Shaddai means God Almighty. The Shaddai, the All-Powerful. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. So I'm bitter. These calamities, the famine that drove her to Moab, the deaths of her husband and 2 sons, were not out of God's control. They were not Satan doing something that the Lord couldn't stop. So she says in verse 21, I went away full, a husband, 2 sons, and the Lord, notice the Lord's in charge of it. The Lord has brought me back empty. The Almighty has brought calamity on me. That can't be, we protest today. Especially we've been raised on a God who just alleviates calamity, who is not sovereign over them. But it shouldn't be a surprise to Christians since we can see it in the cross. The cross was the worst calamity in history, the worst sin in the history of the universe, the most horrendous atrocity. And yet the apostles prayed in Acts chapter 4 verse 28 that the cross was what speaking to God, your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. You want to know what the sovereignty of God looks like? Look at the cross. But Naomi sounds so bitter. She sounds in despair. Today we try to cover up hardships, our own personal disasters with assurances, footprints of the sand poems, that God really does care. And we try never ever to think about, well, if he's God, he's all powerful, he's the Almighty, then why doesn't he stop the tragedies? So we'll blame it on Satan or we'll blame it on free will and cling to a God who couldn't, we think, overcome them. Many people do that because if they believe, like Naomi, that God is in control, they're afraid they'll almost lose faith, like Naomi. What's it look like to almost lose faith? Well, let me tell you a story of a poor widow who came back home to Bethlehem after her husband and 2 sons had died. Her name was Naomi, pleasant, but she said, "Call me bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." She said, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Is the lesson of Ruth that Naomi is wrong about God's absolute control over all things, the sovereignty of God? Is Naomi wrong? Well, no, of course not. But what of her despair? She believes, but she is bitter. In verse 21, "Why call me pleasant when the Lord," she says, "has testified against me?" The picture there is that the disaster the Lord brought in her life, she thinks, is proof that the Lord has, as judge, brought her in to God's court and issued his verdict against her. The Lord is against her. God opposes her. And you can see it in her life. Don't give her just words, just abstractions, footprints in the sand poems. She is convinced God is against her because of what she can see. What does it look like for God to be against you? Well, Naomi knows. She thinks it looks like this: a dead husband, 2 dead sons, no future, empty, nothing, bitterness. You can see it. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. Is she right? Well, she's right about the sovereignty of God. She's right that the Almighty has brought calamity upon her. But is the Lord really opposed to her? Is God really against her? She's right in her theology. Understand? She's wrong in her interpretation of what she can see because she can't see the whole story. She's come to a conclusion that God's against her based on what she can see so far before the end. She's reasoning as if it's all over now. That's what happens when people lose faith. When they look at their life and they conclude God has been opposed to them. God's not carrying them through the hard times. He's bringing the hard times on. Well, that's true. Well, then they conclude he's against me. That's false. The problem is that they're in the middle of the story. They don't know. Naomi here doesn't know. She cannot see where God is taking this. A Switchfoot song goes, "Where is God out in the darkness? Because the voices in my head ain't talking honest. They're saying maybe you made us, then forgot us. But that ain't you. That ain't you. All I know is I still don't know a lot. I don't know how it ends. I'm in the middle of this plot. Yeah, and I found grace for the man that I am not." The problem with basing our conclusion about God being against us, opposing us, or what we can see so far now, is that we can't see the whole story. We're in the middle of the plot. We can't see that God moves in a mysterious way, that behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. What is the providence of God? That's an abstract theological term people throw around. They even name this little town after it. What's it mean? What's it look like? Let me tell you a story. A story of Naomi, Pleasant, who moved to Moab because of the famine that God was in control of, and there lost her husband and 2 sons, and came back home when God visited the land to Bethlehem. She came back bereft. She understood that God was almighty, that nothing happens by chance, that indeed the Lord had brought calamity on her. She's right about that, but she couldn't see it all. She couldn't see the smiling face behind a frowning providence. The voices in her head weren't talking honest. She couldn't see where this would end. She was in the middle of the plot. And she told the other ladies of Bethlehem with tears that the Lord has brought her back empty. At that moment, Ruth probably handed her a tissue. She couldn't see. She wasn't empty at all. She couldn't see what was coming. She couldn't see Ruth right beside her with the tissue in her hand. What is Ruth, though? I mean, sure, she's company, she's helpful, she's loyal, but she's no future, is she? You want to see the providence of God? Look at Ruth. See here how Naomi couldn't see Ruth, not at this point. How Naomi returned in grief, the Lord having brought calamity on her, visited Israel so that now they have crops. So Naomi would come back, gave her Ruth, the epitome of steadfast love, and brought her back at the very end of that last verse. Notice when she's brought back. At the beginning of barley harvest. Now barley is the first crop to grow. So finally crops, the Lord's visited Israel. Now the crops are ready for reaping. The famine is finally over. The plot is about to change. The smiling face behind the frowning providence is about to appear. Finally, barley harvest is beginning. They have a harvest because the Lord visited the people and took away the famine. Now everyone will be out working in the fields, mixing and mingling, workers with their sickles, wealthy landowners out and about, supervising, organizing, the very poor picking out what they can. You want to see the providence of God? The smiling face? It's the beginning of barley harvest. That's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. A destitute young woman like Ruth, renowned in the town for her steadfast love, can now go out in the field to help herself, get some grain, and who knows, since everyone will be out, what some wealthy single man might notice, and who knows what could become of that. A future for you, Naomi. A king from Bethlehem. A savior from the same town. Oh, Naomi, you're not empty at all. Behind a frowning providence, a bitter providence, there's a smiling, sweet face. Naomi, in despair, thinks God has worked all this just for calamity to bring her back empty, that he's against her. She can't see the good yet. She can't see that God has the steadfast love that she's seen in Ruth. She will see it before the story is over, but she can't see it yet. She's in the middle of this plot, after all. It's only the beginning of barley harvest. Can you? Can you see it? God's steadfast love. If you, like Naomi, now Ruth, are one of God's people, and because of that you haven't assimilated into this world and made money or pleasure your God, even in a foreign land, this world, you have clung to the Lord, but there is calamity, there's disappointment, there's disease, there's death, there's famine. Don't give up in despair, concluding, well, he's in charge of all, he's brought this on me, he's against me. Refusing, and don't, on the other hand, refuse to face the facts of what has happened, pretending it's not there or that God is not in control of it. Instead, see what may be now you cannot see in the darkness the smiling face, the word more sure than what you can see now. That if God has given you his Son, will he not also give you all things? Maybe you can't see it yet. You're in the middle of the plot. You're tempted to despair, to be bitter, like Naomi. But remember, it's just the beginning of barley harvest.